How would you complete the sentence, the Son of Man came? The Son of Man came preaching the word. The Son of Man came to establish the kingdom of God. The Son of Man came to die on the cross. Perhaps if we just change the question slightly, it'll make it a little bit more connected to what you're doing. What if we say, we should go? If this is how the Son of Man came, then perhaps that's how we should go. How should we go? Should we go campaigning for political change? Should we go preaching on street corners? Should we go making the most of new media? There are 3 times in the New Testament that a sentence begins, the Son of Man came. The first is Mark 10. The Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. That's a statement of purpose. The Son of Man came to give his life on the cross. The second is Luke 19. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Again, that's a statement of purpose. He came for the lost. The third is Luke 7, verse 34. The Son of Man has come eating and drinking. That's a statement of method or of means or of action, isn't it? That describes how he came. He came eating and drinking. And Son of Man, that's a sort of term borrowed from Daniel 7. You remember the story of Daniel's dream in Daniel 7? And it's the Son of Man who comes on the clouds with the angels in glory before the Ancient of Days to receive all power and authority over the nations. And now Jesus, the Son of Man, has come. But how does he come? With an army of angels on the clouds of heaven in a blaze of glory? That will come, by the way. But no, for now, he comes eating and drinking. And nor is this just kind of subsistence eating and drinking. Jesus goes on, the Son of Man has come eating and drinking, and you say to him, look at him, a glutton and a drunkard. Now, what's a glutton? Glutton is someone who eats too much. What's a drunkard? Someone who drinks too much. So Jesus is kind of seriously into eating and drinking. He's got a reputation for doing it to excess. Earlier in Luke's Gospel, the Pharisees say to him, the disciples of John fast often and offer prayers, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink. That's what his disciples were known for doing, eating and drinking. Jesus spent his time eating and drinking, a lot of time. His mission strategy was a long meal, stretching into the evening. He did his evangelism round the table with some grilled fish, loaf of bread, and a pitcher of wine. Luke's Gospel in particular is full of stories of Jesus eating with people. Robert Carris, the biblical scholar, concludes, in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. And I want to suggest that meals are really important to the ministry of Jesus, and they should be really important to our ministries. My task, and this is, I think it's not the hardest task, is to persuade you to eat meals. But what I really want to see is for you to see the missional potential, the evangelistic potential of meals and how integral they are. And the first reason is that meals enact grace. Again, that little quote from Luke 7:34 continues. So I've given you a bit by bit. Jesus is called a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. This is why eating and drinking were so important in the mission of Jesus. They were signs of his friendship with tax collectors and sinners. His excess of food is linked to a kind of excess of grace, certainly as far as the Pharisees were concerned. In his ministry, his meals were enacting grace. Let me read from... in fact, why don't you turn to, if you've got your Bibles, to Luke chapter 5. One of many stories of meals in Luke's Gospel. one I'm sure you're familiar with, Luke chapter 5, verse 27. After this, Jesus went out and saw a tax collector by the name of Levi sitting at his tax booth. "Follow me," Jesus said to him, and Levi got up, left everything, and followed him. Then Levi held a great banquet for Jesus at his house, and a large crowd of tax collectors and others were eating with them. But the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who belonged to their sect complained to his disciples, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" Jesus answered them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." So when I read it, I'm struck by the fact that the first thing that happens after Levi left everything and followed him, and the next thing he does is hold a banquet. I kind of imagine him coming to Jesus and says, "Okay, what happens next?" And Jesus says, "Well, let's go home and have a meal." Now, the problem here is not the party. The Pharisees knew that God's kingdom was going to be a party. That's how it's described in the Old Testament. Feast of rich meats and fine wines and so on. No, their objection is with the guest list. Scott Barchi, the New Testament scholar, says it would be difficult to overestimate the importance of table fellowship for the cultures of the Mediterranean basin in the first century. I don't think a lot has changed in that, by the way, has it? Mealtimes were far more than occasions for individuals to consume nourishment. Being welcomed at a table for the purpose of eating food with another person had become a ceremony richly symbolic of friendship, intimacy, and unity. Thus, betrayal or unfaithfulness toward anyone with whom one had shared the table was viewed as particularly reprehensible. On the other hand, when persons were estranged, a meal invitation opened the way to reconciliation. Again, I don't think much has changed. That's still how meals function, isn't it, in our culture, across Europe, in my experience. And so the problem here is that Jesus is eating with tax collectors and sinners. And the issue with tax collectors is not just that they collected taxes, as I'm sure you know. It's not actually even that they cheated people in the process. The problem is they're collaborators with the Romans. They are doing Rome's dirty work. And Rome represents the Gentiles who have invaded the promised land and defiled the promised land. The Romans are the enemies of God. And the tax collectors, therefore, are the enemies of God. They're not just the enemies of the people, they're the enemies of God. And what is the supposed Son of Man doing? He is eating with God's enemies. He is enacting the grace of God as God welcomes his enemies. And that's the gospel message, isn't it? That God welcomes his enemies, reconciles his enemies. Or think about the story of Zacchaeus, and think of, here is Zacchaeus, small man, another tax collector as it happens, up a tree, and Jesus comes and says, "I'm coming to your house." And he goes and eats with him. And we're not told anything that Jesus said. No doubt there was conversation and so on. But as a result, Zacchaeus' life is turned around as he experiences God's grace around the meal table. And just think about the dynamic when we sit and eat with someone. We meet as equals. We share together. We affirm one another, enjoy one another. A woman once told me, "I know a lot of people do a lot to help me, but what I want is for someone to be my friend." I think sometimes in our social action, we think we are kind of expressing God's grace and generosity to people, and that's true, we are, but there's still a very kind of hierarchical us and them kind of relationship going on, in which I'm superior, able, capable, and I'm very kind of benevolently helping you, but you're inferior, unable. Just that dynamic is kind of present in the very act. But when you eat with somebody, that whole thing is turned on its side. And you meet as friends, you welcome, you show community, and in that way you express grace. Now just think about Jesus too. He adopts the attitude of a slave, of a servant, when he washes the feet of the disciple. But think too how often he accepts service. He accepts hospitality from Levi. He lets the woman in Simon's house in Luke 7 wash his feet. He asks for water from the woman at Samaria. He's not just the helper of sinners. He's the friend of sinners. Still less is he their kind of project worker. He's the friend of sinners coming, eating and drinking. Philip Yancey begins his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, with a story of a prostitute in Chicago who's asked if she's ever thought of going to church for help. Church, she cries, why would I ever go there? I was already feeling terrible about myself. They would just make me feel worse. Now then compare that with Jesus. Luke 15 begins, now the tax collectors and sinners were all drawing near to him, and the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. The prostitutes loved sharing a meal with Jesus, and they avoid the church he founded like the plague. Something has gone wrong there, hasn't it? The grace of God is radically subversive. In fact, I think this whole theme of meals kind of hooks into something else that's going on in Luke's Gospel. All the way through Luke's Gospel, we have stories of reversals. The first shall be last, the last shall be first. All kind of pointing to a time of eschatological reversal, an end-time reversal, when the proud will be brought low and the poor, the humble, those who have entrusted themselves to God will be lifted high. Mary's song in Luke chapter 1 kind of sets the agenda for that all the way through. And meals are the proof, the example, the model of that happening already in history. Jesus eats with Pharisees and he eats with sinners, but his meals with Pharisees are pretty confrontational. And the meal in Luke 11 is an extraordinary moment because, Jesus is just rude. He doesn't wash his hands or feet, which is kind of rude. And then first thing he says is, you're whitewashed tombs and hypocrites. It's not a good opening line in the etiquette manual kind of thing. They're a picture, the meals that he welcomes those who are marginal and confronts the self-righteous and the self-reliant. Again, Robert Karras, another quote from him. In Luke's Gospel, Jesus got himself killed because of the way he ate. In other words, because he's eating with tax collectors and sinners, with the enemies of God, he's radically subverting the whole religious system of the Pharisees, the whole legalistic system, because he's so radically embodying God's grace. So meals embody grace. And then meals embody community and mission. And members of the church to which I belong, the gospel community, the missional community that I was part of, started, one of them was teaching English as a foreign language and was getting to know a lot of Kurds, Kurdish refugees to Sheffield. And so they started attending a Kurdish cafe. And then after a while they were invited, they were asked, do you want to go upstairs to the casino? And they were wondering what kind of a den of iniquity this might be upstairs. And it turns out basically to be a games room. It's not they must have said, what's the English word for a games room? And someone said casino, but there's no gambling going on. They're playing backgammon. What is going on, by the way, is lots and lots of smoking, which is illegal smoking inside is illegal in the UK. But anyway, never mind that. So you've got Kurdish television, lots of smoke, and people playing backgammon. And as a result of sort of being in the cafe, eating with Kurds, within a couple of years they started doing Bible studies, and now they have a sort of a gospel community that's focused on Kurds. They're going off Kurdistan church planting, and anyway. But what I found very striking about that is 3 doors down from that Kurdish cafe is a Christian cafe. And I have been past it many times, and it's always empty. And no doubt it takes a lot of work and effort to run. But here is a Kurdish cafe that someone else is running for you. They have all the hassle of actually having to cook kebabs and so on. And you can use that to build relationships with unbelievers. Now, I'm not saying Christian cafes are always wrong. It may be that in many contexts that'll be a great way of creating community. What I'm saying is you don't have to assume that as Christians we have to run it and make it happen. There are all sorts of cultural and commercial contexts in which we have the opportunity to eat with people and therefore to build relationships with people. Jesus didn't open a cafe. He accepted invitations. Meals enact mission. They enact mission because they enact grace. It's very strange. Jesus didn't run projects. I want you to feel the force of this. I'm happy to qualify it afterwards and say all these things are good and right things to do, but let's at least feel the force of it for a moment. Jesus didn't run projects. He didn't establish ministry. He didn't create programs. He didn't put on events. He didn't run evangelistic courses. He ate meals. And if you routinely share meals, and if you have a passion for Jesus, then you'll be doing mission. It will need to be both of those things. But if you're doing that... Now, of course, it's not that meals save people. People are saved through the gospel message. But meals create a great opportunity to share the gospel. And it's an opportunity, it's a context where the context resonates with the message. As you speak of grace, you're embodying grace. Jim Peterson, the evangelist, concludes, I know of no more effective environment for initiating evangelism than a dinner at home or in a quiet restaurant. The thing is that, the thing about meals is they bring mission into the ordinary. But that's where most people are, living in the ordinary. And that's where we need to go to reach them. In Luke 11, Jesus tells us, his believers, his followers, to invite the poor, the blind, the crippled, the lame, to come and eat in our homes. And it is set in a context where and in fact that little phrase, the poor, the blind, the crippled, the lame, is repeated in the same chapter. It's only used here, it's the only time it's used in the scripture, where God himself invites the poor, the blind, the crippled, the lame to his great messianic banquet. You remember the story of the great banquet, and the invitations go out, and then people say, I've just bought a cow, I've just got married, I can't come. And so now the gospel goes out, now the invitation goes out to the poor, the blind, the crippled, the lame. And by putting those two things together, Luke is saying, just as God sends out his invitations to the poor, the blind, the crippled, the lame, because that's who we are spiritually, so we are to invite the poor, the blind, the crippled, the lame to our homes. Now that violates our notion of distance and detachment, of professionalism. Mission as hospitality undermines a kind of professional notion of ministry. Mission isn't something I can kind of clock off from at the end of the day. Excuse me, about to sneeze. No, I'm not. There we go. Such is life. Why is it that sneezes are sort of put off by the sight of a handkerchief being prepared in readiness? I don't know. You know, it's a way of thinking about mission that can't be institutionalized in programs and projects. In fact, the sort of challenge is that Jesus is challenging us, as it were, to take mission home with us, to bring it into the home. Now, you might have picked up that I'm really passionate about the role of meals, but I don't know if this is in your church culture. The church lunches just, I hate them with a passion. You know, the potluck lunch, kind of the quiche, yes, I don't know, probably different in different cultures, but because it's a kind of institutionalized form of hospitality. It just feels so artificial. I'm an introvert, so large groups of people don't really do it for me anyway. I'm not asking you to start a hospitality ministry in your church. I'm asking you to open your home and to eat with people. Much is talked about engaging with culture, and that's good and that's right, that's helpful, but we must never let engaging with culture eclipse engaging with people. People are infinitely variable. And they kind of rarely kind of fit into our sociological models. You know, you can have your, you know that, what is the culture of people in France? You know, we can make some sensible answers to that question, but the reality is, France is full of people that are different from one another. What's the culture of working class people or blue collar people? Again, you can answer that question sensibly, but within that you'll find working class people who love opera, or, because people are infinitely variable. And if you really want to understand a person's worldview, don't read a book, have a meal with them, talk to them, hang out with them. Mission is great way of meals are a great way of bringing mission home and making it really contextual. Or again, people often complain that they lack time for evangelism. But what I want to say is, you have 21 ready-made opportunities for evangelism each week already. You're already having breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The proof is there for all to see. 21 ready-made opportunities for evangelism without adding anything to your schedule. You could meet up for breakfast on the way to work, read the Bible with someone. You could meet with a colleague at lunchtime. Put down your book, in the canteen and actually go and talk to somebody. Invite your neighbours over for a meal. Better still, invite your neighbours for a meal and invite members of your Christian community, so that the unbelievers are seeing the Christian community in action. It's great if your neighbour will accept an invitation to church, but my experience, certainly in the UK, is most people don't accept an invitation to church. It's going to take a while of getting to know them. But I can still expose them to the Christian community by inviting them round for a meal. And there they'll see us in relationship with one another. They'll see the love. Jesus says, new command I give you, that you should love one another as I've loved you. This is how people will know that you're my disciples, if you love one another. How are we going to convey the gospel? How are we going to convey that we are disciples of Christ? By our love for one another. Or in John 17, he prays that the Christian community, that you might be one, so that the world might believe that the Father has sent the Son into the world. It is through our community life that we kind of not validate, that's the wrong word, very, very much the wrong word, but that we kind of demonstrate. What's the word Paul uses with slaves? We adorn the gospel. Or to use the language of 1 Peter 3. 1 Peter 3, you remember where he says, everyone should be ready to give a reason for the hope that you have? And for me, I'm conscious that I'm speaking to evangelists, self-designated evangelists. I don't feel like I'm an evangelist. I think that promises so much, that verse. Because what it suggests is that I don't have to go and sort of turn conversations around to start talking about Jesus. No, people are going to come to me and ask me for the hope that I have. The problem is they don't do that. Where's the queue? Form an orderly queue while you... But what we've got to realise is that verse comes at the beginning of a paragraph that begins, I can't remember how it begins now, live in harmony with one another, be compassionate, forgiving, forbearing. It's a word spoken to a community. A community that it goes on and talks about how you do good when people wrong you. Return evil return a blessing when people are evil. It's in the context of a community. It's that community life that provokes the question of 1 Peter 3 verse 5. But where are unbelievers going to see us living in community if they're not going to come to church? And even church is a slightly odd, artificial way of seeing community in action. They're going to see it as we eat together. Invite them to share a meal. You don't need to worry either about, is my Christian community cool or hip, or is it all sorted and together? Is it happy? No, because we're not witnesses to works, we're witnesses to grace. And so in all our muddle and confusion and brokenness, actually that's where the gospel shines through most brightly. As they see us falling out, still being committed to one another, showing grace to one another. That's what will provoke the questions. Let me give just a few examples of things that we've done. They're all going to seem unspectacular, probably things that you've done already, maybe in many cases. That's kind of my point, though. I think we can make mission complicated, more complicated than it needs to be. Here are some things we've done. Again, we're working with Kurds to celebrate Kurdish New Year. One of our missional communities threw a party with kebabs, provided kebabs, live music. Got over 100 Kurds from across the city converging on the party. In fact, our main problem was that whether the floor would hold, because they started doing Kurdish dancing, which involves groups of burly Kurdish men standing in a line with their arms around another, jumping up and down in sync with one another. Literally, the floor was moving about 2 centimeters every flex. So, and then kind of at the end, or at some point, one of the guys leading it said, we've put on this party to express God's love for Kurds. Or my wife invited a work colleague over one Sunday evening to join our family. We have a sort of family, we did at that point, my girls have now gone to university, but takeaway night. So we would have takeout food every Saturday. And she invited a colleague over because that colleague was, she was engaged to be married, and then the fiancé broke it off. And she was just sort of a bit of a mess. So she said, well, why don't you come over and just have a meal with us? And we had some Christian friends there. We hadn't sort of set it up. That was just kind of part of the routines of our life. And I can't remember what we did. There's some dispute about whether we kind of looked back. She says we watched a movie, but I can't. It's a movie I've never seen. So anyway, and then she sent her a text the day after, and she said that your home was a place of refuge. And then, as a result, a few weeks later, we started reading the Bible with her, and then she's become a Christian, lovely Christian. Each month, one of our gospel communities holds a curry night for Pakistani men, where a dozen or so come and enjoy homemade curry and conversation. That's it. There's not anything more to it than that, except that then gospel conversations and opportunities have come out of that. Then they've recently started a similar event for Pakistani women. Another gospel community, every year they close the street. It becomes the venue for a kind of neighbourhood party with music and games and then barbecued food. And that's been initiated by members of our gospel community. We hired out a community hall on one occasion, had people from over 100, lots of different nationalities over, told stories of meals. We used some of the meals from Luke, told a couple of stories of meals from Luke's Gospel. Very, very recently, members of my gospel community held a barbecue, 2 Christian couples, us and them, 2 unbelieving couples, just all the sort of normal stuff of barbecues, conversations about politics and football and the gospel. One of our churches is reaching Bengalis, and one of the things that they've done on a regular basis is they go and buy ingredients from a Bengali shop, and then they go back and they make a Bengali dish, and then when they've made it, they finish. They take it back to the shop and they eat it with the guy in the shop and sort of test out how they're doing. That's the men. And then they sort of talk about the Bible and Islam. It's very easy context then in which to talk. They do something similar with the women, where the women come over and they cook together. In fact, they're teaching the women to cook English food, because the Bengali women are interested in cooking English food. And so it goes on. I mean, I've got other stories, but they're all just variations on the same. What I want you to sort of see is that there are ways of doing mission that anyone can do. None of those things is special. They don't require any special training. You don't have to do a course on apologetics. You don't have to be up with the latest missiological jargon. You just need a passion for Jesus and a passion for food. There you go. And, anyway, I'm getting old. And there's all these books I have which are just full of all models and jargons and processes and on how to do mission, evangelism, contextualization. And it all sounds very impressive, very cutting edge, very sophisticated. And then Luke comes along and says, Jesus' mission strategy was the Son of Man came eating and drinking.